Hi, everyone. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm honored to introduce today's program, which is a discussion about the film Soros. Joining us today is Priscilla Cohen, the producer of the film. The director, Jesse, is having a little bit of technical difficulties, so we're hoping that he will be able to join us a little bit later. And moderating the discussion is Jessica Shaw, the host of EW Live on Sirius XM. During the discussion, please feel free to share questions in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can during the hour. This program is being recorded, and the video will be available tomorrow on the museum's YouTube channel. Thank you all so much for being here, and I'm now going to hand things over to Jessica.
Thank you, Sydney, and welcome to everyone. I'm so happy to be here to talk about Soros. I assume you all have seen it. If not, it's you can rent it on Amazon, et cetera, various other places. Obviously, the name George Soros evokes all sorts of feelings all over the spectrum, and some of the world's reactions to him speak to a far larger issue than the dislike of one individual. I have so many questions. I'm so happy to get to talk to Priscilla about this film, and I would, and hopefully Jesse Dillon as well. If you have questions, I encourage you to put them in the chat, and Sydney will be passing those along to me, and I'll do my best to get to all of the questions. But for now, welcome, producer Priscilla Cohen.
Thank you for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here, grateful to have a conversation about George and about the film.
I'm so excited to dig into this with you. First, I want to just start, what was, you have George Soros is willing to be interviewed for this film. What was your plan of what you wanted to accomplish when you set out to make this?
So I think we have to back up a little bit, because George was not necessarily willing to, to talk about himself. And that's one thing about George that perhaps comes through with the film. He considers himself the sort of wholesale person, which is the person way behind the front line here. And so there's Jesse, which is great to see you, Jesse. He'll be on in a minute. Thank you to the audience. Jesse's having some technical difficulties, but he's here. So I'll continue the question, then we can pass it over to Jesse. So it was in our work with the Open Society Foundations that we were doing prior, for a couple of years, really trying to understand the work that they were doing. And in that work, we had the opportunity, and Jesse had the opportunity to really sit down and have these conversations with George that no one had had prior. As I said, he is not someone who wants to be front and center, believe it or not. This is the man at the center of more controversy than probably any other figure in our world, or one of them. And he really just wants the work to speak for itself. So after several years of Jesse interviewing him and asking about the work, it became clear, I think, to Jesse and myself that we should try to tell a story, because he was so incredibly misunderstood. And I'll pass it along to Jesse. And maybe you can ask the question again, Jessica.
Well, I want to pick up and ask, first of all, welcome, Jesse. So we're unmute yourself, and then I'll tell you how happy I am to see you.
Sorry.
There you go. I guess I want to just follow up on what Priscilla just said about years of interviewing him. When did the process of working on this film begin?
It began, I don't know, after we'd been working with him for a long time, like probably 3 or 4 years at least. And then, at first we weren't going to do it. Then we decided we would do it because we had so much footage. And then it took a long time for him to agree to let us do it. We had to talk to him for quite a bit of time. I think that whole process, took a couple of years. And then it was because, we had been interviewing him, but we didn't have a structure for a movie. That took us a long time to work out what the structure would be, and so it took quite a bit of time.
Right. That was what I was curious about, when the two of you sat down or, and you thought, what is our vision? It's one thing to kind of tell the story of George Soros. His life is absolutely fascinating, and everything that he's accomplished in multiple arenas. But there's also a lot going on. He is clearly symbolic of something else to a lot of people as well. So what was it that you really wanted to explore in the documentary?
So, that's true. He he's sort of a lightning rod for, this extremism. And that wasn't what we were seeing when we were doing the interviews and sort of really getting to know his work. And so I felt like it was really important for there to be something that was more of an objective view of what he was doing. And so that took so what I wanted to say with the movie was just that we could all in our own lives choose to do things that were, helping others. We can't all be like George, but we can all in our own ways do things that can help. And that's what we set out to do. That was the overall idea. And then then we had to work to sort of figure out what the structure of the movie would be.
There's a moment pretty early in the film. It might be the first time that he's on camera, and he starts directing you, Jesse. And it's a very funny moment because here you are interviewing him, and he kind of turns around and he says, "Okay, we can start by talking about my life, or we can talk about my philosophy or whatever." And it's even his doing that gave such a peek into who this man is. So I would love to hear from both of you and I don't know, Priscilla, if you were in the room when this was happening, or if it was just, if he just wants Jesse there and with a camera or whatever, but tell us, take us behind the scenes. What's it like to talk to him and to get stories out of him? Because like Priscilla said earlier, he's not the most give me press, turn a camera on me kind of guy.
Yeah. Well, fortunately for me, I've had a lot of experience with people like that. So, I think that that was one of the first interviews we did with him. So I think that what you're seeing there is a guy who just has something to say and is just going to say it. And so, usually with people, when we interview them and they're sort of in that headspace, you sort of let them exhaust themselves, and then you can start really asking them questions. And so, he's very much what you see on camera there. He's very, very intelligent. He's funny. Charming when he wants to be, but he can also be super tough. I mean, what was your thought, Priscilla?
So what's interesting about that moment is you're seeing, I think, the way his brain and his mind works, which is that, and that's obviously what probably made him such a brilliant investor and made him, one of arguably the great philanthropists, as controversial as it is that always holding that duality. So he's saying, okay, wait, we can talk about my philosophy, we can talk that's complicated, we talk about my life. Well, let's start with my life. And I think what was so helpful in that moment, although we didn't know it till years later, is that actually helped provide the structure for the film. Because if we were working back from this idea, why is he so kind of reviled, and why is he at the center of all this controversy? And particularly when we think about anti-Semitism and issues around the Holocaust, et cetera. And so that contextualizing where he came from was really the way to help frame the story, because his backstory, his childhood, is so kind of terrifying and disturbing. And I think it's very important that people understand this man as a young boy growing up where he did in Hungary in the context of World War II, and then of course with the invasion of the Russians. So I think that was the framework for us that really helped us with the structure.
Yeah, I mean, let's jump in and talk about his childhood. I found that stuff fascinating. Tell me about that. I mean, and like you said, he's in Hungary in the 40s, and he is as obviously the Holocaust is happening. Jews are being killed around him. He passes as a Christian. He is protected, and therefore doesn't wear a yellow star. No one knows he's Jewish. And I was curious how you got, I mean, there's a lot of really interesting footage. What was it like researching that time in Hungary and that time from him?
You know, it's tough, you know, to sort of get that perspective. You know, it's very hard to understand anything about the Holocaust at this point, you know, and you know, he's you know, I should say it's very hard to understand why it happened, you know, what the reasons are that it happened, because we can certainly understand what did happen. And I think that when he was growing up, you know, I'm not sure as a young child he sort of understood all of that complexity, but he I think had to deal with things that were unimaginable, you know, a couple of times, you know, a couple of very random things. You know, one, you know, was during the Holocaust, and the other was when the Russians came in and took it over, which was a period that lasted much longer. But I think that those things, because he had such an unusual father, the father, you know, had a certain perspective that I think he imparted to George. And then I think our challenge was to try and figure out how to get footage of a lot of those things in Hungary that didn't have much footage. So it was very tricky to sort of figure out how to tell that story.
Yeah. And I would say also, again, I think one of the historians that we interviewed in the Stephen Kotkin really talked a lot about, we don't know, you know, it's in retrospect, we all wish we could do certain things, but I think what we're trying to convey with the footage was how do you react? How do you survive a catastrophic, you know, event in world history? How do each individual's, you know, how do people going to respond and survive? And I think what Jesse was, you know, talking about, Theodore, his father, was an extraordinary influence on George, and hopefully that comes through in the film, and doing kind of what it takes to just keep the family safe. But at the same time, Theodore, there was the story about passing out cigarettes, which I think.
Can you tell that story? Because I was just going to ask you about that next. It's an extraordinary story, and so clearly when you the story does not come from George in the film, but maybe you can just relay that a little bit in case anyone needs a reminder, because it's clearly something that informed his thought process.
Yeah, Jesse, you want to talk about the issue?
So, you know, when George was, you know, a small child, I guess probably, you know, about 10, you know, he and his father went to a store to buy cigarettes. And when he came out, he gave all the cigarettes away to Jews, right? Which was a dangerous thing to do. And he did it because the father did it because, you know, George asked him, said, well, why would you give away these cigarettes? It was so hard for us to get them. It was so dangerous to get them. And he said, because I want them to know that after the war, that there were good people here in Hungary, good non-Jews here in Hungary. And so he was still concealing himself as a Jewish person, but he had the foresight to think about what comes after a lot of these things. And I think that that's a very, very powerful thing, especially for now, you know, the times we're living in now, where we have the rise of extremism again. And, you know, it's like, why is that rise of extremism and populism occurring in this time? You know, maybe it's because we've, you know, forgotten how hard it was to open all these borders, you know, so that it's easy to close them again. But you know, it certainly is problematic, you know, when we think about what we want our societies to be like in the future.
Yeah, and he was a young child. That's important. And I think that again, the ability to have foresight, for the father to be thinking, okay, whatever was going on, and we have no idea, obviously, what the father was thinking, but this idea that there will be a day, the war will be over, and how are we going to mend? How do we move forward? You know, we don't want to keep staying in these horrible, like what, and again, to me, that becomes the beginning of some things which he discovers later around an open society where you're going to have to live amongst people that you do not agree with. And of course, we see how difficult that is. And oftentimes it does end in war. You see it across the world. You see it, you know, you saw it generations after. And but that's the question, you know, how can human beings who revile each other figure out how they're going to live together afterwards? It's a fundamental human question. It's a really complicated one.
Yeah, absolutely. And he talks about, in the film, you talk about after, I think it's even in an interview with him, he talks about after Nazism and communism, there has to be something else. And again, there has to be an open society. There has to be, and then it's a pretty amazing moment. He has this look on his face and he said, it's democracy. And he starts beaming, and it's, you know, it's kind of a devastating moment, because here is someone who was born and went through, I mean, there is, his mother was raped by communist soldiers who came post Nazis. I mean, it was war on war and violation on violation. And then he has this moment. Did you get a sense of that he really linked having his childhood and his upbringing directly linked to what he wanted to create in the future?
I did. I mean, I certainly, it took years to get there in the work that we did with him. But yeah, you know, I think that hitting the nail on the head is that these ideologies, Nazism, communism, both were flawed because they ultimately, you know, nobody had any choice in what they were doing. And so what he was looking for when he thinks about an open society is how do you deliver the most amount of freedom to the most amount of people? How do you make sure that everybody has a voice? You know, I'm not even sure George agrees with a lot of the voices, but he is impassioned about them having the ability to express themselves. And I think that's you can trace it, you know, you can trace it pretty clearly from Human Rights Watch to South Africa to you know, each little thing that he was doing, he was learning about how to affect these you know, this change that is desirable. And I think that the hard part of it is saying, well, we don't know what this should be. The people should decide for themselves. That can be misconstrued as if you're meddling, which is a very strange sort of concept. But I think the thing is that you know, he believes everybody should have a seat at the table, and that comes from his you know, his experiences.
And I'd like to add a little bit to that, which is that, I mean, again, not having lived through any of that, what it must have been to live through two devastating periods, like you said, Jessica, right? So it's we're dealing with Nazis and then we're dealing with Stalin, right? So he then, of course, goes on and he gets out of there and he goes to London and he, you know, becomes this unbelievably successful, driven businessman, I think. And early on, he meets Karl Popper, which, of course, is that foundation for an open society. But I think it's not till later. I mean, all of those things perhaps were brewing, but I think it isn't really till he has been going at this pounding rate of being this extremely successful investor, where there's suddenly a moment where the rest of, in my opinion, this is not George, in my opinion, the rest of his early life catches up with him. And there's like, you know, as everyone has a sort of a midlife crisis, right? And we have them throughout our life, where it's like, okay, now what am I, now what, you know, what is my personal responsibility? But for sure, all of the ideas around working towards an open society have got to be from the way that he grew up. I mean, you don't, you know, we take, and he would always say to us, so many of us take democracy for granted. And we cannot do that, as we've seen in the last many years, you know, what's happened, because it's a fleeting thing. It's an idea, and an open society, even bigger than a democracy, is something you have to constantly work at.
And, you know, it also gets at, we talk about this a little bit in the movie, about the edges of our moral responsibility. You know, we're talking about who are, you know, you could say, well, you know, I want to protect people in my family. I want to protect people in my block. I want to protect people in my city. I want to protect my country or the world. You know, where does the edge of our moral responsibility lie? And that's a fundamental complex question for each of us to decide.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious, and it's some member of the audience mentioned this as well. When you talk, Priscilla, just now about how he has this moment, and in the film he talks about it, he's like, people were kind of boring me. Like, I wanted something. He wanted something to have meaning and impact, and he described it as a kind of midlife crisis, and he embarks on all of these even more philanthropic things that he was doing and really getting involved. I'm curious how much of that he felt was informed by being not his childhood specifically, but by being Jewish. And I think that's a question that people are asking in the chat. What was then and what is now his relationship to his Jewish identity?
Well, he can't, if you're Jewish, you can't escape it. It's going to be around you no matter what. But I think that, and I never really talked to George specifically about his feelings of Israel, but I'm not sure that, I think that he feels like we need to help everybody, and everybody at least needs to be heard in the town square. So I think he identifies very much as Jewish, but I'm not, if we roll that into Israel, I'm not sure, how he feels about Israel.
Right. And I know it's not even about Israel, really. I think that when you think about what are the fundamentals of any religion, is really about really protecting human rights in the end, right? Or being good people. And so I think it's hard. We did not really get into those really deep conversations about Judaism, but he definitely identifies as Jewish. His children, everybody in his family. I mean, he's Jewish, and he's proud of that. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I was just curious if it's interesting because I hope he has pride in being Jewish. I think as he was doing it, I think about tikkun olam, of the very Jewish idea of repairing the world, that hopefully many people share, but I know that it's a fundamental tenet of Judaism as well. It is interesting because I think that, and I want to get into a little bit, there's so much hate for him. And that is very much to me grounded in just a real virulent anti-Semitism. So I guess, what was your perspective? And here, obviously you've known him or worked with him, et cetera. When you could step back just as documentarians, how do you see the negative aspects of the world's reaction to him?
Well, I think that in the beginning of his philanthropy, he was concentrated so much just on doing the work, and he never had any press, that I think that he had no idea that it would sort of bloom up into what it has. And I think it takes on a life of its own. Anti-Semitism is real. Sometimes I wonder why it's real, but it really is real. Like why we people don't like the Jews. It seems like a very strange position, having spent a lot of time in Israel, and I'm not sure why that is. But I agree with you that it does. A lot of times, countries need somebody to hate, and he fits the bill. He's very easy for him to fit the bill. I'm not even sure it's about him as much as it is about, we're having, if you take Hungary, for instance, we have all these problems here, but you know what? They're not our fault. They're Soros's fault. He did it, and it's a very unfair thing, which I think has very little to do with him,
I also think it's interesting to think about the journalist tells us in the film that the Lyndon LaRouche. So there's a moment in time where he becomes a really great scapegoat, and there's a concerted effort to make him an enemy. And I think we have to think about, well, why him? And I think it's because, again, from my perspective, Mr. Soros does not, you cannot necessarily, predict his stance on things or what he might, support. It's really about, it can be controversial. So he may be going, he'll be challenging conventional, something that might feel conventional or American. I think there's in the story around George Bush Jr. about what was happening there. And so suddenly, if people on one political side, in this case, it is on the right, they say, okay, we need to sort of start to build a case against liberal, progressive people. George is the perfect person. So then, there becomes this, he becomes the guy. And then, as Jesse was saying early on, he has not been, although in his later life, he has more reflection. He's not afraid to take a stand about things that he believes in, whether you agree or whether I agree. And at the foundation of it, for him, it is this guiding principle of, as Jesse said earlier, protecting the most freedoms possible, having more people having a voice. And it doesn't always sit well, right, with the kind of conventional public point of view. And so it becomes controversial, that idea. And then the idea that he also is not front and center. He does not give interviews. So now it's very easy he's the guy doing this and he's the guy doing that. And in many cases, it's not him doing anything. He will support people that feel left out and wanting those people to have a voice. And I'm not sure that that's always a popular stance, right? And it doesn't always work.
Yeah, I mean, especially with groups like the Rohingya or, in Europe, he supports, totally spacing the name of the groups he supports in Europe, but it's like those things are people who have nobody to speak for them, and maybe don't even have.
I think Jesse's talking about the Roma.
Roma. So they and the Roma is a very different culture. We've spent a lot of time with them, and they may express themselves totally differently than other people. And I think that he was once, considered, like the Roma or the Rohingya. And I think that always weighs on his mind, that there needs to be somebody that makes it possible for those groups to speak for themselves,
Yeah, I think the Roma is a great example, because that's a group of people coming from all over the diaspora, right? They're coming from everywhere. And some of them, of course, are Jewish as well, but they're feeling like they're being left out of society. They're completely marginalized. Jesse and I did some work, speaking with so many folks, all over Europe and Eastern Europe. And it's, it's not until recently have they been able to come together as a group. And in this time, I think, where there are a lot of voices saying we need to have a voice, that work is incredibly important. So again, I think it's really about, it's complicated. George's way of operating and thinking is complex. And that goes back to a lot of his core value, which is critical thinking, which is at the heart of really all of the work that he supports. Starts with education. For him, it's about education. We need to be educated and we need to be thinking. And that is for everyone around the world. And those were the really early things when you look at South Africa and that early work. I mean, that's really at the core of everything. And if you have people that do not have access to education, which is a fundamental human right, we get into trouble, because people can't really understand what is their truth, what is really going on in their societies. And so, and we have a world where we have inequities around education now, obviously.
Yeah, for sure. Sorry, go ahead, Jesse.
Well, just going to say, this idea that Holly brings up, that all Jews are liberals and leftists, I don't think George probably would identify as a leftist. I think that he doesn't think of himself within that structure. I think that he's looking at each individual problem as with a critical thinking at the heart of it, and then deciding how he might assist the people who are involved in that. So I don't know that he identifies with either party in America.
It's Right. And yet some people who dislike him very much identify him with, and that is, it's so, it's always, and I find his story so inextricably linked, unfortunately, to how others view him. I think some people can go through life. Bill Gates is mentioned in the film about he can do all sorts of things, and people will, it's kind of taken at face value what he does. George Soros can do something like Priscilla mentioned and fund education, and immediately there's that there among some a very I would argue anti-Semitic thought of there's this rich Jewish person pulling the strings, this trope, this vile, that is for centuries has been brought up about Jewish people.
I think that's
true.
A great point, Jessica, because I feel like when we think about those tropes, and we think about anti-Semitism, and we think about, money, greed, and this sort of elitist of education. Okay, that's what I think Holly's asked about what anti-Semites think, right? Is that it's control of the world. And I think that's also probably at the heart of a lot of this. And again, it goes back to what are your values as a society? If you don't really value the idea of education or having a voice, and of course now in this country and probably all over the world, the question of what is education and what gets to get taught, and we're in even a more extreme time now. But I think
which does not have critical thinking at its core. It has politicization of what the textbooks are going to be.
Jesse, it doesn't even have evolution at its core.
No, yeah. I mean, and we're being asked to take those things out, of course. And so again, I think what's terrifying to think about is what happens if you have societies that let go of some kind of critical thinking, some objective understanding of fact, science, or whatever. What happens, and we're obviously seeing it in a very terrifying way here now in the United States.
Like where we're mandated to teach both sides of the Holocaust. Totally ridiculous.
What is the other side of the Holocaust? I'd like to know. I think this audience, what is the other side? There is no other side.
So, you also see that now happening to Bill Gates, who's given away over $10 billion, and has focused a lot of his efforts around vaccines, and was definitely contributed to this vaccine that's making people be able to live their lives, go about more normal life. And he's hated for it. It's a very strange reaction,
Yeah, the way I agree with you, and that's definitely been this thing. Oh, Bill Gates is trying to put, chips in all of our brains and everything. But to me, it's almost in mainstream media, maybe it is dismissed as fringe, whereas you have many clips of mainstream media talking. I wanted to ask you about the Tucker Carlson interview, where he literally describes George Soros as, quote, the embodiment of the problem. Tell me about, tell me about your thought process, just as filmmakers, of saying, we want to get someone who hates him to kind of try and elucidate where this distrust comes from.
We had quite a list, and Tucker Carlson was the only person who actually agreed. And I have to say, he was a gentleman in the interview, before the interview, and I think it was important to have try and get that perspective in. A lot of but most of the people wouldn't talk to us. For a while, we were going to have the English Brexit guy. Priscilla, do you remember his name? She doesn't remember his name, but or she's not saying. But in any case, he said yes, and then then it just sort of wound around into nowhere. But we tried, lot of those characters are pretty tough to get on camera. So I appreciated that Tucker at least gave us some time.
She's saying Jeremy.
Not Jeremy Corbyn.
I want to say something about what I know, and now, I mean, we all have probably our personal feelings, but I think what is important about unpacking and really trying to objectively understand why this incredible hatred of George, I think this is an important point. Thank you for everyone who's trying to guess the name. He says something about what Jesse alluded to earlier. Here's a person who's acting like a sovereign, going in with a lot of resource, a lot of money, going into what some might say, why is he able to go into these different countries and support? Because what he's doing, I just want the audience to understand, he's not doing anything. Has the folks that he's working with kind of listening, and where are some human rights abuses, or where are people not being heard? And there becomes support for just to get more voices. I think that everyone needs to understand that. The misconception is he's marching in there and doing all this stuff. But I think what Tucker brings up, which is important, is it feels like meddling, and it feels like, who is this guy to go in? And, if we all think about it, and it can happen, if somebody who had that kind of power and money, I won't name the person, but I have something in my head that could go in and do that, and he had or she had opposing views to human rights, how dangerous that could be. So I think that is an important point, and I think that he makes that, and I think we have to make that point, because you have to understand why everybody hates him, or why many people hate him. But I also think he's also taking a stand, and that goes back to this idea of our moral responsibility. If you think that people are being abused, it could be sex workers, maybe you don't agree with sex workers and getting their rights in Latin America and Africa and in the United States, or having really fair systems around people being in prison unjustly. There is a feeling that there might be human rights abuses, and you have to go in and say something, because at the end of the day, when you're alone, did you do the right thing, that you felt that you adhered to a moral code? And I don't see anything, I haven't seen anything to lead me to believe that George is funding really nefarious and dangerous, hateful causes. I've never seen anything like that in all the years that we've viewed and looked and watched and talked with people around that work. But anyway, I think that it's important. He's willing to take a stand. I don't know that you're going to find a person now in our lifetime moving forward, because I think he comes from such a, as we say, that history of Nazism and Stalinism and fearlessness. And I'm not sure you're going to ever see a person like George Soros ever again, which is sad to me.
I found it really interesting when he says, and you guys talked about that he doesn't do too much press, and there's really interesting footage, I think, of interviews that he did when he was somewhat younger, when clearly he was more open to it. And at one point, I think he tells Jeff Greenfield, I think it's in that interview, he says, "I'm happy I irritate people." And I thought that was, I was curious if in your talking to him, if he had a sense, if he has a sense and kind of takes a step back of why he knows that there are people out there that hate him. And by the way, a lot of those people are, it's not even like I want to give them the credibility of and the respect to say that this hatred is justified, because when you hear and it's in the film, when you hear some of the things that people say about him, it is, if it doesn't make the hair on your neck stand up, then you have learned nothing from history. But I'm curious what his perspective is. Does he see it as anti-Semitic? Does he see it as I don't know. I'm curious what he thinks about it.
I'm not sure he's so driven to go forward that I'm not sure he thinks about the fact that people hate him so much. I'm sure he's aware of it. But the scary part about it, is that, when we do see this form of hatred out there, me and Priscilla have worked on the problem of anti-Semitism around the world. What it makes you think is that that's a bad situation could rise again. So I think for all of us, there is this subconscious or conscious fear of that happening again, and just why it's so important that there is an Israel, and why it's so important that we can never let that happen again. So I think that gets rolled into it. I think the pandemic, I never thought that we would live in a time where we all would be in our homes for a year. That would be inconceivable before the pandemic. So I think that we're living in a time where, history can repeat itself. And so we have to take a stand. And I think George's perspective would be just to keep on doing what he's doing and not think about it too much. I've shot with George all over the world, me and Priscilla have, and a lot of those places he's just walking around. He has a little bit of security, but it's like not much. And he wants to talk to the people. He doesn't want anything in between him and the people he's trying to work with. So I do think that's a bit dangerous, and I think that this is a scary time for sure.
I think he also says something, in the film. He says it twice, but if he does say, if I'm making people angry, then I think I'm doing something. I'm riling them up. And he said it early on in sort of those interviews that we pulled from, earlier interviews. But also he says it again, it's taking a stand. And what does that mean, to take a stand for what you believe in? And that's really, I think, for us as well, kind of at the heart of this, why we felt we had to tell his story, because here is a person who is taking a stand, who is risking, and has these sort of access resources, that are really were unparalleled at the time. And then he's willing to make a stand. And he says at the end of the film, he's willing, he doesn't want to lose his life over it, but he's willing to stake his life on this work. And that's it's a very rare thing, very powerful.
He for a long time, when we started working with him, I don't think he thought that the foundations would continue after he was no longer around. And then somewhere during that time, he decided they would. And that is a very fundamental question as well, is whether foundations can move on past an individual and keep the same character. You look at the Ford Foundation, and I'm not sure what the Ford Foundation is supporting now, the same things that Henry Ford would have set the foundation up to support. So, the institutions, I think, will go on, and the question is whether they can retain that same commitment. And I'm not sure what the answer is. I don't think anybody is. Well, time will tell.
Yeah, for sure, and hopefully they will continue in his beliefs and in the spirit of that. But he's not. We can't mourn him yet. He's not. He's still around.
Right.
Very active. 91 years old.
Yes.
Yeah.
And still working all the time.
Working every day, all day long.
I'm curious when you stopped filming, because clearly, I think you watch this, and certainly there's a mention how you have helped fund vaccine research, and there's there mentioned, George W. Bush is it, but I was curious if any post Donald Trump stuff was in there, because that also seems like it was a turning point, and especially since George Soros was very much targeted by his campaign.
We made it during the time of, we really put it together during the time of Trump, and felt like Trump is such a polarizing figure on his own, that I think it would have just sucked the movie into a black hole had we started to include that. So we sort of very, purposely avoided any mention of him, which I think was the right thing, because you want George to be judged on his own space. So we stopped filming somewhere in the middle of that, and then we had to finish the movie because we showed it at a film festival and there was a deadline, and that was a good thing too, because we could have filmed this movie forever.
Yeah, I mean, the editing was just really complicated, and at some point we just have to stop. I think if any filmmakers in the audience knows, it just you always want to keep going, but you just have to hopefully leave you all with an experience and a feeling about something, which is what we can do.
Is there something that as you spoke to him about the various causes that he has championed and the organizations that he has helped fund and the countries that he has visited, is there something that you felt he was the most proud of, that he was able to support either, financially or just by being there?
No, I think he's really he's really focused on what's tomorrow. He does not look back, and he doesn't have any sentimentality about these things. If it doesn't work, which was in his trading life too, if it doesn't work, he just stops and moves on. And that it's in and of itself is a lesson as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know. There's so many things and they show up in the film. I mean, again, I think it's bigger than, I'm sure there are things, I don't really know what they are.
Maybe the work he did in Hungary, he loves Hungary, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I think the education, although they had to move, the Central European University, again, I think a lot of it is around education, but it really goes to the bigger idea, which is bringing people out from the margins in and letting them have conversations. And the one thing about George that's kind of fascinating as well is that he will stay and support something long after, he'll stay there longer. He also will make a change very quickly. He can pivot. He is absolutely swayed by the people on the ground doing the work, which is really great. He will say he can change his mind. We've seen him in a room change his mind, which is kind of remarkable. He's open. And I think that, when Jesse talks about when he goes to a place or meet people, Jeffrey Canada tells that beautiful story about when he goes into Harlem, here's this little guy, he's sort of small, he's just a guy walking in. He doesn't want to have a whole entourage. He just wants to talk to people. We were with him in Senegal, where he did that as well with very little security. There was a group there that was, really incredible group that was trying to look at very corrupt politics in Senegal, and he was very interested in them. And they were using rap as a communication tool where there's low literacy. But to go with him and film him as he was sitting down for hours. Now this is the hot sun. We're in Senegal, incredible place. And he's sitting there for hours, and everybody else on the team is exhausted. George was already in his 80s at that point, late 80s. And he just wants to talk to every single young person there to find out what they're thinking. And that is who he is. He's just curious. He wants to understand what's going on. And we have to remember, George is a genius. He is an intellectual giant. So he has that ability. I've only been close to that, never like him, maybe a few times we've had the opportunity to film some really brilliant people, but so he can hold a lot of ideas in his mind and really want to understand what's going on, how people are thinking, and then begin to formulate a sort of a strategy, which is kind of remarkable.
Yeah, there's a moment where he starts to explain how making a financial decision, and then he's always thinking 2 steps ahead of what the impact will be on society, and then even beyond that. And it's kind of fascinating to get this small moment where you can actually see the wheels in his mind turning. And is that what it's like to sit and talk to him?
Yeah, I mean, he's you don't know what he's going to say, so he always has an interesting perspective on things that comes from a wealth of experience and his own studies about things. So yeah, he's a fascinating character for sure.
So earlier in the chat, someone asked if his children, you mentioned it's the foundation, and you didn't know if it would continue beyond his life. Did you get a sense? I mean, his children are interviewed in the film. It was really interesting to hear. I love at one point his daughter made I thought a wonderful observation about people's takes on him. And sometimes, depending on the lens through which you're looking, something that he is doing is either seen as, this nefarious thing or the most extraordinary thing, and to consider that it's important to consider the perspective. I thought that was a very important and kind of crucial take when you're talking about him. But did you get a sense that his children want to continue what their father started?
Yeah, very much so.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And they'll do it in different ways. Some of them have their own work that they do. And then probably one of them is more kind of, directly involved with Open Society Foundations at this point. But I think that it's incredibly, it's how they've lived, and it's incredibly important to them to continue some form of, work in the world, human rights, social justice. They all have that.
Which is interesting, especially when you go back to how much his father informed his way of thinking, and to be able to pass that, from generation to generation, is powerful. What was when he saw the film put together? First of all, when you're like, okay, Mr. Soros, I'm going to sit down and show it to you, are you like dripping in sweat?
We were not in the room. We were not in the room.
We weren't in the room. But
we were not in the room where it happened. But we were worried, but I think we got a communication back. Was it like pretty good or something? I can't remember. Like something very which for us was like few. I mean, again, this is a person who,
it was not a personal note of,
it was just okay. He's very measured in a lot of ways. And so anyway, we were very excited to get a little bit of, okay, maybe it's okay. Again, this was a reluctant person who did not really, took a lot of work to try to get to be able to tell the story, but we're really grateful that we had the opportunity to do it.
Yeah, there seems like there's a it's a real small needle to thread that in his personality. There seems to be a humility to him,
absolutely,
but also a very strong confidence, which depending on how I think that balance is with humility, can either come off or just can come off in different ways.
Yeah, well, I think that's true. I think he does have he's an incredibly strong personality, and he does have humility. And the question is always, what, and he's just going to make the decision for himself. It's not like you can anything we would say would change his mind. He's going to talk to the people, arrive at a conclusion, and make the decision. And that makes him, pretty unusual character in this day and age, because most people, if you look at the government now, they can all be swayed one way or the other. So it's just, you can't do that with him. He's going to decide for himself.
Yeah, it is really interesting. I want to just close by asking the two of you, who's on the other end of the camera for the next film? What are you both working on?
We don't have a documentary going on at the moment. It took a long time to make that one. I think we're just waiting to find a subject that grabs us enough that we want to spend a couple of years on it.
Yeah,
it's a big commitment.
I bet. Yeah, I bet. Well, whatever the subject is, or whoever the subject is, I'm certainly looking forward to seeing it. The film is Soros, and I hope that everyone has seen it. And if you haven't, that you go check it out. I want to thank Jessie Dillon and Priscilla Cohen so much for joining me. And of course, to this audience with all of your wonderful questions. I'm going to throw it back to Sydney.
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Jessica said. Thank you both so much for joining us. And thank you, Jessica. This was a really awesome event. I learned so much. And thank you all for joining us. Everything we do at the museum is made possible through donor support. To those of you watching, we hope that you'll consider making a donation to support the museum or becoming a member and joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can check out at the link in the Zoom chat. Have a great afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us.